Hello, everybody. Welcome to Origins. I'm Michael Walling. I'm the festival director. And this is the last in this series of Origins Writers events, to which I'm welcoming Kyle Whyte, who's just popped up. And hopefully, any minute, Jay Griffiths will pop up as well and join us. There she is. Hello. Um, the Let me introduce them both. Kyle Whyte is an enrolled member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation. I hope I'm saying that right. And he's also George Willis Pack Professor of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. Kyle's research addresses environmental justice, focusing on moral and political issues concerning climate policy and Indigenous peoples, the ethics of cooperative relationships between Indigenous peoples and science organizations, and problems of Indigenous justice in public and academic discussions of food sovereignty, environmental justice, and the Anthropocene. One of the very positive developments in the last few months, not everything has been positive, but some things have. One of them was the establishment by the Biden-Harris administration of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. It has 26 members and Kyle is one of them. So delighted that you can join us this evening. And then Jay Griffiths, unusually for this series, is not an Indigenous writer. She's a British writer living in Wales, but she has a deep interest in Indigenous cultures and in environmental activism. Jay's the author of Wild and Elemental Journey, Pip Pip, A Sideways Look at Time, An Archipelago, A Love Letter from a Stray Moon, Kith, The Riddle of the Childscape, Tristimania, and just recently, this new book of essays called Why Rebel? Jay's been writer in residence at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and she's also very much involved in Extinction Rebellion. She was actually arrested during the 2019 protest. And her speech from the dock, which is published in this new book, Why Rebel, is, for my money, right up there with Thomas More, Emmeline Pankhurst, and Nelson Mandela. She made the judge cry, and me too, while I was reading it. So welcome both of you to Origins. It's lovely to have you here. And welcome also those people who we can't see but are listening to us. The interaction with all of you is important for this too. So if you have questions for either or both of our guests, please do put them into the Q&A, and I'll do my best to get as many of those across as we can. But let's begin by, well, some sort of wide framing questions just to get us going. Jay, why don't I start with you? All your books to date, all of them pretty much, have engaged with Indigenous culture as a kind of source of learning and possibly of healing, I suppose, for the world. Can you tell us a bit about why you think it's so important to engage with these ways of being that have been constantly suppressed by the globally dominant culture? And you need to unmute yourself.
It's such a big issue. It's such a big thing. I think one of the first reasons why, to me, it just seems so acutely important is this thing of the fragility as well as the stupidity of the way that the dominant culture lives, and a kind of sense of how does the world feel if you take away all the bits and pieces which are sort of damaging, exploitative, and also just really silly in terms of ecology and the rest of the living world. And I think I've also been so struck by how non-Indigenous cultures and non-Indigenous individuals are in so much need of ways of thinking which are bigger, wiser, older, kinder, because I think it's almost as if that modernity forgets that this culture is ours as in mine, the dominant culture, is so recent and so weird, and it's 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 almost unspeakably cruel in its relationship to the natural world, but it's also so stupid in its relationship to itself. The only culture which knows that it might be causing that it might be causing mass extinctions, including such a threat to its own civilization. The only civilization which is knowingly causing it, knows exactly what it's doing and carries on doing it. It's absolutely insane. And so I suppose, although, you know, I understand that, you know, that I really don't want to kind of generalize and say, you know, Indigenous cultures this, Indigenous cultures that, but there is a kind of commonality, and it seems to me that especially at the beginning of my writing life, when people were very unwilling to listen to wisdom from Indigenous cultures and the experience of Indigenous cultures. And I felt like, if possible, what I wanted to be was a kind of messenger between, you know, between cultures, so I could listen on the one side and speak on the other. That's a long answer, sorry.
So that's absolutely fine. I hope a lot of the answers will be long. You know, if you want depth, you have to go deep. I mean, I think, you know, I relate to that sense of trying to be some sort of messenger sitting between the cultures. I also am very aware, as I know you, that, you know, we're sitting here in Britain, we're sitting in the country which did it. This was the place from which Indigenous lands were colonized. And so I think there has to be a sort of spirit of humility, I suppose, with which we approach Indigenous thinkers like you, Kyle, and I saw you nodding through a lot of what Jay was saying. So, I mean, I suppose to put the flip side of the same question to you, you know, what usefully do you think we non-Indigenous people might learn, or perhaps ought to learn, from Indigenous knowledge communities like the ones in which you operate?
Sure, absolutely, and good to be in dialogue with both of you, and good to have a chance to listen to what Jay just shared. You know, on a topic like climate change and, you know, very dangerous human-caused environmental change, you know, oftentimes that topic, at least from a scientific perspective, is like itself, you know, presented as a topic that's brand new in terms of like people understanding that humans have these complicated impacts on the environment. You know, like with climate change and climate science, for example, you know, if you ask a lot of people, well, when did climate science get going? They'll talk about a few experiments in the 19th century, and then talk about, you know, some of the key movements in the 60s and 70s to identify, you know, what we now understand to be the trend in warming and the destabilization of the climate system. But, you know, Indigenous people all over the world, I mean, climate science was actually one of our oldest sciences. I mean, we've been tracking seasons and climatic trends for generations, and have our own ways to do it. And for at least a lot of Native folks that I'm in dialogue with, or even my own community, Potawatomi and more broadly Anishinaabe people, you know, we've always understood that the human societies have both local and regional footprints on the environment and can impact the climate system. And we have, you know, stories after stories that are lessons about what happens when you know, human society confronts a destabilized or disrupted climate system. And what I think is important is the lessons from those stories are never, you know, we just didn't have the right technology, or we just didn't have the right, you know, industrial science. They were actually lessons about, you know, how we need to restore bonds of responsibility and reciprocity. And, you know, in terms of what Jay shared about kind of the global Indigenous movement, yeah, it's absolutely, it's true that, you know, each Indigenous people, we do have our own traditions, and we're very diverse internally. At the same time, we do have this dialogue going. So, you know, for example, in dominant languages like English or Spanish, there's tremendous dialogue across Indigenous people about ethical responsibility, about reciprocity, about living with the environment. And those dialogues are extremely important because they're actually identifying things that are particularly lacking in the world today. You know, for example, a lot of Indigenous people right now are focusing on the fact that that corporations can do things on our land, both whether it's the fossil fuel industry, the mining sector, currently with the renewable energy sector and the clean energy sector, they can do things on our land without our consent that don't respect our self-determination. And so a lot of Indigenous people are focusing a lot on the importance of what it means to be in a society that values consent. And that's because the current situation we're in is one that for many decades has destroyed relationships of consent with Indigenous people. And so a lot of what Native people, at least in my opinion, are pointing out are things that are really lacking in our setup today. And so I think it's important to note that, you know, all traditions in the world have, you know, good things and about what they can share. And I don't think we're claiming to be the best at anything, but I think we are claiming is that we've got a pretty good set of insights on some of the problems that are happening right now. And, you know, one of the reasons why we have those insights is because they're embedded in our own wisdom and our own traditions, but also we have those insights because we've seen a massive threat to our culture and way of life over the last few hundred years. And so we've seen on the inside what it means to encounter those systems of power and authority that have not cared about our health and our well-being.
Yeah, and I guess colonialism in itself is, you know, makes climate change happen. You know, and I suppose that's why a lot of the, you know, there's so many links between Indigenous movements, anti-racist movements, and environmental movements, that this is in many ways all part of the same thing. I'd like to just go back to something which one of you said a moment or two ago. I can't even remember which one it was. But the idea of there being reciprocity, it was you, Kyle, and the sense that we need to start thinking differently about relationship to the world, and that technological solutions are not in themselves enough. And maybe you could just speak, both of you, for a moment to the sense that the only way we're actually going to make a change is culturally. And well, Jay, you said that that the Western culture, the dominant culture, actually knows what it's doing. So the big question isn't, you know, what have we got to do to stop this? The big question is, why aren't we doing it? And you know, that's surely a cultural question, isn't it? Jay, maybe you could respond first and then Kyle.
I think one of the things that I'd look to is the way that the dominant culture has constructed itself to be separate from nature. Everybody knows this. I'm not saying anything exactly new here, but there's a very precise and horrible match between what's happening at the moment in terms of a kind of public narcissism, so that our leaders are narcissists, that people as individuals are being encouraged to be narcissistic. That there is a sense in which the solitude of the narcissist is something that is being experienced through the technological world, and that sort of, and it's also it's a species loneliness when humans in the dominant culture see ourselves as separate from nature. And this is then something which has been, you know, which has been absolutely hammered home by religious orthodoxies for, you know, for thousands of years, to say that, you know, that we're different from, above it, isolated from, and actually lonely because of. And it seems to me that you know, that one of the most important things about why we don't, why we know what there is to be done, but we don't do it, is it in some ways it's kind of this idea that that in this separation from the living world, we've misunderstood life, that we've given properties of life to ourselves and to money, to profit. we have occasionally given qualities of life to certain ideas of divinity, but even those ideas of divinity, we've tended to say are kind of, are extraneous from nature, that they're sort of, that they might be above us, they might be kind of, somehow within us, but not absolutely the ensoulment of the world, of the living world. And I think in a sense is that I never I don't mean any disrespect to anybody who has any particular kind of any particular belief that is not rooted in the world, but what collectively we've done, even people who cease to consider themselves to be religious, is that it's as if we've, having taken the soul out of the living world and all of its components, we've given that, for every kind of spider that was considered to have a soul, we've given that to a pound coin, we've given it to a $10 note, and then we've protected that, and we've given that a kind of a dominant and a divine status, and that then gives us justification, blanket collectively gives us justification. So for example, the most acute example recently is when Rio Tinto exploded the cave that was sacred to Indigenous Australians in the Pilbara region. They did it in minutes. They did it for the money, and it was like, this was a cave that had demonstrated 46,000 years of continuous inhabitation. And in a sense, it's like, I couldn't think of a more perfect example of saying, the gods of the land don't matter, as well as Indigenous cultures don't matter, just pure and simple racism, but the gods of the land, because they wouldn't have blown up St. Paul's, let's face it. So the gods of the land don't matter, but also kind of, money does, and it's like money talks, and that's, that's how viciously it speaks.
Yeah, I mean, you make me think of the concept of legal personhood, that corporations can be people, but it's still only in New Zealand perhaps that the Whanganui River has legal personhood. This is very, very rare. Kyle, do you want to respond to some of these ideas? I can see you thinking as Jay's talking.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I work on a lot, and try to convey as widely as I can, is that when we think about issues of like sustainability from an Indigenous perspective, they're not just like theories for us, or they're not just ideas, right? If somebody says that they're an expert in sustainability, well, for at least the Indigenous perspectives that I'm familiar with, that means that you know how to practice it. You actually know how to do it. But the dominant societies that a lot of our communities live in, they're not actually societies that know how to do it. For example, they don't know how to create, say, a technology that will lower carbon footprint and then put it in practice in a way that won't simply reconcentrate wealth in the hands of non-Indigenous people, members of dominant groups. And so they don't know how to do it reciprocally. There's not a culture of reciprocity in a country like the United States. Native people, tribal people, we gave up our land, our way of life, our economies, and the result of that was this massive, carbon emitting industrial U.S. economy. And so we're very aware of that at a visceral level. And I wouldn't necessarily call it a gift, but it's a contribution that is not recognized at all by the United States. And then we end up in the position where we're scratching to try to get, very small benefits and to restore a fragment of what we call the nation-to-nation relationship with the United States. And then they treat us like we're doing things that are parasitic on them. And so we don't live in a culture of reciprocity. And because we don't live in a culture of reciprocity, what it means is that both the bad stuff, the fossil fuel sector, but also the good things, the renewable energy technologies, will always be implemented inequitably or unjustly. And what I think a lot of people don't understand today is, everybody, whether you're, a member of the dominant society or you're from a group that's experiencing injustice, is that we all think that this time period is going to be different from those old school colonial periods. But what I think is important to recognize is that it's probably not that different. Each period of colonialism, racial capitalism, entrenchment of patriarchy, of ableism. These are all periods where the perpetrators of the violence often believe themselves to be responding to some crisis. Could have been a religious crisis that they thought. It could have been an economic crisis. There were actually previous European perceptions of climate change crisis. Several hundred years ago, there was a panic that there was global cooling that was going to, to happen. In addition to a similar crisis in the 1970s. And when dominant powers respond to crises, they do so in a way that runs roughshod over any possible reciprocity, trust, consent, responsibility that may have been there. And I think in each time period, people think that they're doing things differently from the previous colonial period, but they're not. And I think that whether today's time and the future is going to be any different will depend largely on whether members of dominant groups will actually recognize that they're probably not doing anything much different from their, colonizing ancestors, and they're simply repeating forms of colonialism, but just that look a little bit different.
That's incredibly discomforting for someone who's sitting where I'm sitting, where we do attempt to build relationships, and as Jay was saying earlier, bridges, messages between the cultures, and yet there is always, I think, for people like us, this sense that we may just be appropriating someone else's culture. We may just be doing something trendy because it happens to fit. And I don't know what we can do to avoid that. And I guess it's to do with, as I said earlier, humility, but I'd be interested to know what you think about that, Kyle, how the relationship might be rebalanced to stop that kind of colonial mindset and that you're suggesting just repeats itself.
Sure. Well, I do think there are a couple of strategies that I've thought through that maybe strike more at an emotional level, and I'll build off of Michael a few of the things that you mentioned. So one thing that I notice, and I've done a lot of this thinking through the areas where I experience a lot of privilege. So for example, gender, or education, and I find in each of those areas, right, when I confront the horrors of what people over time with that privilege have done, it's very easy for me to think, okay, how can I be the hero? How can I be the one that's recognized for doing things differently? And I might think that the goal is to be humble, but it's always a self-serving form of humility where I expect to get a certain positive feedback at some point, and I expect that if I just do the right things, I'll be able to do them swiftly. But when we're dealing with these landscapes where there's been decades of trauma, there's been decades of violence, we can't repair relationships quickly. I can, for example, implement a policy of free, prior, and informed consent, but that's not going to repair generations where consent has not been respected. And I think we can all recognize areas in our own life where somebody who has power over us says, well, look, I've changed the law, or I've changed the policy, or I swear I'm going to treat you well, but we don't feel that way, right? We don't trust them. And for people that are experiencing different types of privilege, they have to understand that it's going to be uncomfortable, maybe for their whole lifetime, that they're not going to receive that comforting feedback that they've made in intervention. And I think when people are open to that and recognize actually that, say, for Indigenous people and Native people, we haven't been comfortable for generations, and we've actually had to learn ourselves how to navigate the system in the United States, the system in Canada and Mexico, the international system. We've had to figure that out with no help or guidance. And so for allies, right, that are constantly asking for advice, I think it's important for them to understand that there's also a level of independence and self-starting that they need to do, because that's what we had to do and have to do today. And so there are many amazing people out there who work really well with tribes, people of color, with other populations that are facing inequities. But I think, you know, when you talk to people like that, and again, in areas where I'm privileged, I've tried to take this up too. It's not much of a heroic narrative, and it's certainly not a narrative where they think that by dint of their own efforts, things are going to change drastically. It's usually a multi-generational project that they're part of.
So let's think more widely about this question of time, because I'm sure you're right. You know, cultural changes are very, very long term, and yet, Jay, I mean, I'm sitting here reading Whyte Rebel, and I'm terrified by how short the time span seems to be in which we need to affect really drastic change, and you know, at a political level and so many other levels. And there's a problem, you know, because actually we won't really get people to act in a way that's appropriate unless we change the mindset. But mindsets take a very long time to change. And I don't know. Jay, wander around in that problem for me for a minute, would you? And I think Kyle can join you in there, and we'll find our way through the maze.
I think one of the things that I'd start off by saying is that there's that with the climate crisis, there's been this attitude for a long time that that if you kind of like quietly, gently give people the facts with issues like the soil erosion and the collapse of nutritional value of the soils, to the point where the UN has said it might be 30 harvests left we have in the world, it might be 100, but that it's limited if we carry on like this. Now, when those kinds of facts are given very calmly, very dispassionately, like a kind of, you know, like scientific statistics, with the kind of tone of voice that I'm using now, then it encourages people to think, well, it's kind of sounds worrying, but, you know, it can be put off, because this is not the tone that mammals use when they're absolutely terrified. When mammals are properly terrified, it's like you know, is that you see rage, you see trembling, you see fear, you see real emotions. Now, I totally understand that I'm going to get round to the time thing. I totally understand that, you know, that scientists giving the data and statistics and the modeling on the climate crisis cannot speak in those ways, but the rest of us have to. And I think the thing is that I would say that things can change fast depending on the type of communication that's given, you know, so that for example with COVID is that entire societies changed so drastically, so quickly, because people, not because people were told the facts and were told, don't worry, at some point, you know, technology will sort it out. People were told, this is terrifying, be terrified, you know, don't end up being in a ward for this, don't end up, you know, don't end up dead, and kind of look after your older relations, in fact look after everybody. And people were really frightened, and societies changed. And I think one of the, you know, one of the problems with it is that, you know, that the kind of the corporate side and the politicians have really kind of murdered the truth on this, because they have told us that you know, that slowly the kind of, you know, that the tanker might turn, but it's going to take a long time and you can't change anything quickly. And it was completely untrue, and it is still untrue. I think that, you know, that in a way the kind of that the climate crisis is still a symptom of ways of thinking that will take a longer time to change. But I would also say the COVID crisis was the result of ways of thinking where we did change fast when we had to, but the reasons for it have been going on for an awfully long time. So in the COVID situation, you know, one of the things that I find so disgraceful actually is that the strongest likelihood is that it's a zoonotic disease. So it came from an animal species, it jumped across species, and it ended up with humans. And so people across the world stopped everything. We stopped school and work and pleasure and weddings and pubs and football and theatre and events like this. We stopped everything except the one thing that got us into this situation in the first place, of like properly examining our relationship with the more than human world, and properly looking at how the exploitation and the kind of and the devastation of wild places and the homes of wild creatures. I'm very unwilling to say habitat because it's clinical, but that sense of the homes of so many other creatures. We devastated those, and we've paid a terrible price, but that is not being discussed. And it's like, this is crazy. But the sort of, my wandering answer in terms of time is that, that I think it's both. I think societies can act extremely quickly. Societies can act extremely quickly when there's a war, and when there's a pandemic. It's a matter of choice. And I think it's also a matter of kind of what is perceived to be real. Now, human health is perceived to be real, according to, the dominant culture, and according to the dominant culture's media. This is very real. Money is perceived to be very real. So in that sort of, the kind of capitalist divinity that I was talking about before. But the lives of people who are not in the centers of political power or media power are not considered so real. They don't have the same profile. They don't have the same kind of recognizability. And then when you have the kind of, all the realities of the more than human world, which takes such imagination to really kind of grasp, like what does a wasp feel like? What's a kind of, and these are not spurious questions, like kind of, we humans seem to be very good at wondering what our cats are thinking, but actually sort of saying, well, what about the plankton? It's like, what does it need at this point? What about the moss? What about peat? PEAT, I say quickly. So so I would say, in some ways, I think that it could be seen as a faster response crisis if it was talked about properly, and if the reality of minds of the entire living world was taken into account.
Yeah. It's also a question, though, isn't it, of people perceiving things to be temporary. I mean, they responded quickly to COVID, but they're now talking about going back to normal, which actually was the problem in the first place. And during a war, you say, well, when the war is over. This one's different, I think. Kyle, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, building off of Jay's points, I think one of the things with COVID, but it's also with climate change too, is that there was nothing normal about the situation for many of our communities prior to the pandemic. So we talk about the fact that governments moved quickly, that other parties moved quickly. That means something in one sense, right? But for example, in the US context, African Americans and Native Americans experienced severe harms due to COVID, and the causes of that vulnerability were never addressed. They still haven't been addressed, and there's no plans to significantly address them in the future. And I think what's important, and again, it's very similar to climate change, is what's the actual world or set of situations that we're trying to protect and preserve. And for a lot of Indigenous people, right, we get there's these journalism stories about us that talk about the fact that climate change is like affecting the last access we might have to a certain fish or plant or ecosystem, or whatever it is. But that's somehow treated like, we're trying to protect that particular situation. Like, we're not trying to protect a world of scarcity for us where we can't even practice our own culture. like we're not trying to, protect that world from climate change. That's a world that we never wanted to be in the first place, and that we're actually trying to move into a different situation, a better situation overall, and no different from with the pandemic. You know, we're not trying to go back to before the pandemic, because that was a position where we experienced social and environmental vulnerability that then led to the death and, you know, other negative effects on our communities that in the US context, white people did not have to endure that and go through that. And so we haven't been in a normal situation for many generations. There's, you know, back to normal for us, if it meant anything, would mean a long time ago. It wouldn't mean a year and a half ago, right? And so people need to realize that we have different assumptions about what normal means, and about the world that we're trying to protect. We're not trying to save the industrial world of the last couple hundred years. We're not. I know it's the world that we learn most about in our education systems, but for Native folks, we're thinking of the big time period, and this is a tiny period, right?
Yeah.
And we've been in colonial periods before throughout our history. We've had issues with different societies, including other indigenous people, but we're once again in a dystopic situation, in a post-apocalyptic situation, and we're trying to get out of it. And so I think there's a difference between climate change advocates that are trying to appeal to people who think right now is normal and right now is a time before a dystopia. But then there's also, and this is in the environmental justice movement, is we're trying to appeal to our communities who understand that they're in a post-apocalyptic scenario. And I think there's different sets of actions that you know, would be taken. And the last thing I'll just mention is I appreciated Jay's points about, you know, what it means to be terrified, to be, you know, urgent about climate change. And one of the perspectives I know that a lot of Native folks that I talk to, you know, point out, and you know, there's certainly a perspective that I have, is that from us, right, you know, the dominant populations in so many parts of the world, they weren't terrified during the time periods where our communities were massacred in warfare. They weren't terrified when, you know, they realized that their society was one that had reduced our land base to zero. They weren't terrified when they put our ancestors and so on in boarding schools and committed genocide or things like sterilization. And I mean, it's horrible, right? None of those things terrified them. And so how could something like climate change terrify them? And if climate change terrifies them, but all these other inequities don't terrify them, then what does that mean about how they're going to address climate change? And, you know, my concern is, why haven't people been more horrified by the state of the world, both connected and not connected to climate change?
Yeah, I guess this links to the question of what do you actually do, and it really interests me that the two of you have taken, or appear to be taking, because you've got huge amounts in common, but you appear to be taking very different paths in a way. In that, you know, Kyle, you're there advising the administration, and you know, Jay's supergluing herself to the railings, and you know, on the one hand there's rebellion, on the other hand there's working, you know, right at the political top. And I'm sort of interested to hear you both talk a little bit about the decisions to work in those ways, and how that relates to, you know, what you were just saying about how can you make them scared. Maybe Carl, you go first, and then Jay.
You know, one of the challenges that, you know, I experience in my work is that when we think about taking action, so taking action to support tribal nations who are seeking to address climate change, but the current system that we're in right now makes it so that there's a lot of distrust between different spheres for taking action. You know, so for example, people that work at the grassroots level will be very critical of people that are engaged in like federal government activities or tribal government activities, or, you know, people in tribal government will be critical about how grassroots activists approach, you know, or represent, you know, tribal sovereignty. And, you know, I mean, these are just simplifications, but, you know, one of the things that we need to very much focus on, and this is where I focus my, a lot of my work on is that, you know, for tribal nations, there's all of these spheres that we're part of that can be vectors for change. Federal government, you know, United Nations, your own tribal government, your own cultural ceremonial groups, your grassroots organizations, right? These are all leverage points in different ways, but we need to make it so that they work together, actually. You know, some of these leverage points are ones that we didn't invent. Like, for example, in the United States, the idea that tribes are recognized by the United States as sovereigns. Well, that definition of sovereignty is not our definition of sovereignty, but it is a form of nation-to-nation recognition. So we could work effectively within that, as long as we don't realize that it's the only sphere that's available to us. So what I think we need to focus on in every single action we take is what, you know, spheres are each of us part of, and are we being accountable to the people in the other spheres? So, for example, my work with the White House, you know, I take very seriously the idea that my work is not defined by the, I don't know, the rigor of the recommendations that I try to make on that committee, but it's actually defined by whether I can retain accountability to people that are working in those other spheres, and ultimately to the communities that are impacted the most by environmental injustice. And so what I recommend is that there, you know, so many actions to address climate change are needed, but are we doing actions in ways that are accountable, and are we measuring the impact, and are we motivated by the grave responsibility to be accountable and to foster cross-sphere accountability, which will create greater coordination.
I suspect, Jay, that resonates quite strongly with your sense of how you operate within XR and so on.
Well, it absolutely does. I mean, I think the way that the image that I would use is the image of biodiversity, is that, you know, that all of these things are necessary. It's kind of that, you know, poetry is necessary, activism is necessary, sensitive, intelligent politics is necessary. So in a sense, it's that I think that there is a lot of kind of wasted energy, even in plenty of activist circles as well, of people kind of, you know, some people whose only response is kind of, you know, glue yourself to the railings, and other people whose only response is, you know, write to your MP. But they're both legitimate, and you know, and actually kind of all forms of attempts to create change over this issue are legitimate. And I think the other thing, where again I echo what Kyle said, is that one of the most important things is that people start where they are, and some of that, the thing is that it's almost like one of the problems with any kind of mass protest is that people cease to be their kind of full selves, placed where they are in their professions, their families, their societies, and they become simply a body on the streets, which obviously can be important for a really big protest. That's what you want. But I think that it's a very skillful part of good protests, including Extinction Rebellion, is to say you start where you are and you change what you can right around you, and also the conversations that flow from that very naturally, because it's not the kind of awkward kind of, you know, protester on the street, microphone in face kind of, you know, personally I never know what to say in that situation. But so yes, so in a way, I'm just kind of saying what Kyle said as well, that, you know, it's kind of diversity is really crucial. It's absolutely crucial.
I like the fact that in the thick of it all, you mentioned poetry and say poetry is important. And this series of talks, we started with two poets, Joy Harjo and then Natalie Diaz, who's here this evening listening to you. Hello, Natalie. And with both of those talks, both poets talked very interestingly and I think importantly about the challenge of working in English when you're from an Indigenous background, even though it's your first language, because the culture doesn't actually quite want to fit into that mindset which is there in the language. And English is so good at capitalism, it's good at naming things. And actually Indigenous languages don't work in that way. And there's the great passage in Robin Wall Kimera's book about the moment when she realized that the word for bay in your language, Kyle, Potawatomi, doesn't mean the noun the bay, it means the action of being a bay. And I'm really interested to sort of think with both of you a bit about sort of exploding language, because I certainly in work of, well, both of you that I've read, but let's start with you, Carl. You often seem to be sort of worrying away at the edges of academic and philosophical language and using concepts which are perhaps not always de rigueur in those areas.
Absolutely. I mean, the language is a really complicated topic, but extraordinarily valuable. And I want to mention, some important aspects of it. So, I think at one level, I think people are becoming slightly more, familiar with Michael, one of the things that you mentioned, which is that, Indigenous peoples' languages have a lot of knowledge encoded in them. They have a lot of relationality in them. You mentioned the, Potawatomi language and Anishinaabemowin language. Yeah, it's mostly a language of verbs. You communicate through actions, and it's also a language that doesn't place some of the rigidity that English does on hard and fast gender dualisms. It provides a lot of grammatical freedom for people to choose how they would wish to say things. And so there's a lot of self-determination within it. And, for a lot of Indigenous people, it's very hard to articulate certain forms of knowledge or certain aspects of information without without being able to use their own their own language, including being able to use very precise phrases and expressions to describe details of how, say, like an ecosystem works, that in a scientific approach you might just have a few words for a few variables, but in an Indigenous language you might have the capacity to refer to 20, 30, 40, 50 variables, and but also simultaneously as actions. But there's actually other things that I also really want to put on people's radar about language that are very core, I think. For and obviously, the Great Britain, the United States, and others are to, regrettably thank for this, right? But, the English language, represents a certain form of linguistic dominance. And when we participate in the English language, we're reminded of that. We are complicit in that. And, for me, obviously I spend a lot of my time working with students and others for them to succeed within English language institutions, but that's not the same as when we work together on trying to awaken our own languages, right? So it doesn't matter whether somebody is fluent or not in that own language, right? But when you're part of that process of awakening your language, that's a community building process. That's a process where you can have self-expression in ways that aren't available to you in the English language. And so it's important to note, I think, that, Indigenous languages, whether they're fluently spoken in a certain sense or whether they're being rekindled, that they have a special significance for us, no matter what stage some of us might be at in the learning process. And it's also the case that in many communities where English is the first language, they still use a number of different terms and so on, and they use them in relation to English in ways you wouldn't be able to understand unless you were from that community and carry a lot of place-based wisdom. And just the last thing I'll mention, super quickly, about the topic of language is that it's also the case that, you know, the way that a lot of Indigenous people use English and have is definitely different. And one of the things, you know, you mentioned, Michael, that, you know, English is good at naming things, but it's also the case that a lot of English speakers just are very confident that, you know, once somebody coins something, that has to be the way to do it and to say it. And I don't know why they're so confident, because and, you know, and what I appreciate is a lot of Native folks that work primarily in English or another dominant language like Spanish are really pushing those conventions and trying to get people off of that weird platform of rigidity.
Yeah. Jay, this is your world, isn't it? I mean, if ever there was someone who liked to with language.
I think what I want to start off by saying, well, apart from Kyle, it's like you've done it again. It's just like you've said everything that I was just about to say. Better. So the first part of my answer will be fairly brief, but what we British did was a colonialism of land, and then it was a colonialism of time, because we imposed our sense of time and timekeeping and time values on the rest of the world, and we imposed we English imposed our language. But that kind of, you know, the importance of linguistic sovereignty is it's almost, in a way, it's just so poignant and really painful when you know that there are cultures in the Amazon for whom medicine is encoded in the language so exactly that how to heal with a certain plant is knowledge that is held in a word, and that languages can not go extinct but be forced into extinction. That was the first thing that I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that I think it would be an enormously helpful political experience for every English and indeed Spanish speaker to have to learn another language, because there's nothing that makes you realize the dominance of your own language if you're an English speaker. There's nothing that makes you realize it quite as quickly as the experience of being a language learner or trying to express yourself in a second language. That's when you realize that language is an issue of power, and it's an issue of personal power. It's an issue of colonial power. It's also, though, that when you learn another language, you realize all of those aspects of kind of, that your own language is not, especially English, is not innocent. That it's got all sorts of kind of extraordinary etymological sort of cultural values in it, including the relationship between right, R-I-G-H-T, as in correct, and regal. So all sorts of things can basically connote might is right in the heart of language. And not but, and while I think all of these things are true, I also consider myself to be unbelievably lucky being a native English speaker, because it is an extraordinarily rich language. And actually one of the things that makes me sad about it in terms of the climate and ecological emergency is the way in which, and I don't want to repeat what I said before, but to be very exact about certain things, like when terms are used like, species, the species populations falling, and habitat loss, and fish stocks kind of declining, that this language is an absolute lie. It's an absolute lie. It's like saying kind of, indigenous cultures kind of somehow faded away. Do you know what I mean? They kind of like fell off a bit in the, over the last few hundred years. It's like, the language needs to be it needs to be truthful. It needs, we need to be talking about active murder of people, the genocides, for example, that are carrying on in West Papua, which is a place really close to my heart, where I visited because I wanted to write about what was going on there, and quite how important it is that the truth is told in words that have life and reality. And then on the other hand, the kind of, the sense in which when one is writing about the more than human world, is that language is a living thing, and it needs to be at its absolute sort of, at its writhy kind of wildest, curliest, wriggliest, best, to actually give on the page what the kind of, what all of these other and other realities of our huge ecologies mean.
Thank you. I'm desperately tempted to follow that up by talking about physical language and the body, but I think I shouldn't, because this question is starting to come in from the audience, and I would love other people to get to speak to you. So there's a question here from Emma Barnes, who asks, to what extent do you think difference in cultural relationships with ancestry or future generations impacts future generations, I think, impacts our relationships with the environment and fears about climate change? She says, broadly speaking, I feel that Indigenous peoples seem to be very connected to their ancestors and future generations, whereas attitudes to climate change in the UK seem to revolve around an individualist, I won't be here, it won't affect me attitude. I wonder if either of you have any thoughts. Who'd like to go first? Kyle?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Absolutely. I appreciate the question and how it was stated. One of the things in one of the fields that I've had a connection to, the field of philosophy. If you look in the Anglophone literature and philosophy, there's a whole bunch of philosophical work that, while the work is trying to eventually defend the idea that we have responsibilities to future generations, there's all these puzzles that it seeks to create about whether we're connected to future generations at all. And so they sort of find all these puzzles within sort of a European or settler Anglophone approach to demonstrating that it's not that obvious that we really have duties or obligations to future generations. And I think that serves as an important contrast, because I think for a lot of tribes and Indigenous people, that's really not a philosophical issue. Rather, I think philosophical for us is, how do we learn lessons from our ancestors, and how do those lessons carry forward to what we need to do to protect future generations? So for example, for a lot of Native folks, we're trying to recover the histories of our ancestors, both the good things they did, but the bad things that they did. And we're trying to understand, well, what were they thinking at the time? How did they navigate certain challenges? What lessons did they learn? And something I mentioned earlier is that part of what we're doing when we reconstruct, when we recover, when we remember some of our ancient stories is looking at how we have kept certain types of lessons over the years. So, if I were just to interpret it fairly broadly, in a lot of Anishinaabe traditions and stories, again, the lessons learned from our ancestors, from those stories that keep perpetuating into the future, are really about, ethics and justice and equity, and then we break them out into reciprocity and trust and kinship, right? They're not about scientific discovery, or they're not about an individual heroic person that was really brilliant and told everybody how to save themselves. And so, for us, I think the philosophical challenge is that process of dialogue with our ancestral generations, but also what it means to take seriously the fact that many of them screwed up too. You know, and I think one of the biggest contrasts, right, at least in a context like the United States, and I'm sure this has resonance in the UK, is, you know, we get, you know, hit with these congratulatory histories of people that did pretty horrible things, and then we don't recognize, right, that people who weren't like the president or somebody that ran a big company, that the people that weren't in those roles actually were doing very meaningful things, right? And so we get these histories where it's only a few ancestors that are remembered, of a few types, very celebratory, and those histories don't make me feel very good, and they make me feel that if I'm not the president or if I'm not a corporate tycoon, that I'm kind of a waste of of being. And I don't think that's a very good way to be for supporting our future generations.
To bring more. Jay, past generations, future generations.
I think one of the things that I would look at is the way, if you try to kind of like stand in the future and look back, that's the stance that I think that those of us alive today need to take with regard to the situation that we're in, because of the seriousness of it, you know, for all the things we're talking about. And I would also just add something which none of us have yet mentioned, is the collapse of insect populations, because that actually is one of those things that, you know, people generally just go, oh, insects, little things don't matter. They are the angels. They are the angels. They're the ones that basically create life, that on which we absolutely depend. And so when we're talking about, you know, the climate crisis, the climate injustice that has been happening, the kind of all the ways in which colonialism now is absolutely seeing, you know, it's how I would phrase it is, you know, we in the dominant culture, we sowed the wind, but we're forcing others to reap the whirlwind, because it's most likely the kind of, you know, the poorest nations and the poorest people in nations who are going to be the most badly affected. So in a sense, what I'd say is that, you know, that I think the stance of jumping ahead into the future, looking back and saying, how should this generation act at this point of such multiple crises? And in a way, it's kind of like, you know, how to be a good ancestor. Not, and I don't mean a good kind of, you know, parent or grandparent or great grandparent necessarily, but how to be a good ancestor for that future. I was talking to an artist friend of mine the other day, because he was mentioning the possibility of an artwork of burying himself alive. And I said, I think it would be really powerful if you buried your daughter alive. Obviously not to kill her, but just to say, look, this is possibly the most transgressive thing that you could do, is to do something which so symbolically looks as if you're burying your own child. But that is in fact what collectively we're doing with you know, as this situation continues without being properly and urgently stopped, is that we're burying our children. And that as an image is kind of something that, you know, I can't live with that sense of my not doing anything. I can't live with that.
And of course you're speaking only a short time after the discovery of the mass grave in British Columbia, so that's a horribly accurate image.
Yes.
There's I think there's kind of three questions here which all seem quite similar. So if I may, I'll kind of read them all out and we'll see where it takes us. Kristen Brown says, as English language speakers, how might we examine, interrogate and modify our language so as to expose the structural disavowal of violence within it? That's very well put. She says she asks as a speaker and a post-secondary educator in an English department, and she's put English in inverted commas. Anna Pedibon, I hope I'm saying that right, says she'd like to ask Kyle if he can elaborate a bit more on how non-Indigenous folk can cultivate humility, become a good ally to Indigenous communities, and try to break the dominant mainstream. She says in Italy, we're already back to normality. That's in inverted commas too, even worse than before the pandemic, and the ecological crisis is basically ignored. And then Tara O'Leary thanks you both and says she really resonated with the sense of lack of reciprocity in British American dominant cultures, and asks if you know of any good examples of reciprocity in writers or academics connecting with Indigenous communities. There's many examples of extractive experiences at the grassroots level. These are all related because, of course, they're all questions about how can we dismantle these problems we're talking about. You know, what can we do with language? What can we do to make the dominant culture less dominant and more humble in its relationships with Indigenous cultures? And are there good examples of reciprocity actually happening and being engaged in? I guess, Kyle, this is one for you to start with, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I appreciate your putting together these these nice questions, given their different, overlapping areas. I myself am a a teacher that teaches in English, and I teach in an English language institution. And in the main class that I teach, which is Indigenous sustainability and environmental justice, we read a lot of different Indigenous traditions that invoke their own languages within writing that's in English, or sometimes writing that is in Spanish. And I think what it takes is for us to really teach that work in a way that does a couple of things, right? On the one hand, I don't think we want to be glossing over the involvement of Indigenous languages and just kind of mispronouncing stuff, or not really trying to dwell on terms. And you don't have to be a specialist in that Indigenous language to respect it, and to both have a conversation in a classroom setting, but to also recognize, and this gets to the humility point, that there's no way that that any of us in that classroom space would have a lot of wisdom on what that word means. And then also not to do it in a way where, if there is somebody in the classroom that may know because of, say, their tribal background, to not put them on the spot unless they so desire to volunteer that information it's meaningful for them, right? And so I think we have to work a lot on what is the learning environment, what is the classroom experience that we're looking for, that's really fair to everybody, and that doesn't rely on certain strategies which take the pressure off of the teacher from actually being accountable to the challenges of language. And in terms of this topic of humility and taking action, what I would say is something that I find to resonate the most is that a lot of us are not really used to doing things at what I would call the speed of kinship. Part of the reason why it feels uncomfortable, I think, for a lot of folks, and why it feels kind of hopeless that there are actions that can be taken, is that we're in a world where we're so divided. I mean, privileged people very separated and divided from people that experience inequities and injustice. And it seems so far away. How do I connect? What can I do? And if we realize that there's a reason for that, the reason for that is we haven't been raised up in a system where there's a real genuine sense of consensuality or reciprocity or trust or accountability, and that to try to repair and restore those relationships is going to take a while, and it's going to have to go step by step. I mean, to be able to have a collaborative impact on a tribe. And if you've never connected with that community before, you've got to focus on all your energies to just make a connection so that at some point that community might ask you to do something, right? And so our labor needs to be spent on being at places, showing up at places, making friendships with no strings attached, right? I mean, that's one of the problems that I experience a lot is people will approach me trying to be a friend because they have a project in mind. How about just approach me as a friend? Let's be friends first. And maybe one day one of us will ask for help on something. So anyways, there's so many great queries of the questions that I obviously could go on, but I'll just stop there.
Okay, Jay, your turn to pick up some of those threads, if you may.
Well, yes, I think one of the things that I'd say is the one of the best ways to I was going to say de-assert, but that's a really kind of ugly. That's an ugly phrase.
It's not one of your best linguistic inventions, no.
But to try to counteract that kind of sense of the dominance of one's own language, one of the very, very, very simplest things is listen, number one, and number two, read, because when you start reading into all sorts of kind of experiences and cultural experiences that are not one's own, is that's it's almost like that's where plurality absolutely has to root itself in your own mind. And I think one of the worst things that we can do as speakers and readers is only read things that are written in ways in which we speak, because that reinforces the sense that our way of speaking is kind of is the only way of speaking. And I think that it's like, plurality is a it can be a bit shy, but as soon as it's really warmly welcomed into the mind, it's kind of, it blossoms. It really blossoms, I think, linguistically. So that's what I'd say, is kind of listen and read.
We're coming to the end of the time, but there's one last and rather beautiful question from Graham Harvey. He's addressed it specifically to Kyle, but what he says applies monumentally to both of you. He says, even at your most wonderfully provocative, you always seem positive and encouraging. Does this indicate that you have a lot of hope about the future?
Oh, I know who I know who Graham Harvey is. Good to be connected again. Well, complicated question. I don't believe in, so me personally, I don't believe in hope as as something that we need to motivate us. But again, I don't try to take shots at people that that use hope. But in terms of just my perspective, my grounding, I am very critical of hope and how hope is used. Now, in terms of, and I think this is an important issue to address in relation to some of the other questions. I do try to be pretty friendly and pretty friendly and disarming, and that's kind of the way that I am. But I do hope that that's not in a way perceived as like the way to be, because that's just more natural to me. And I like to build teams and relationships and so on to move forward. That's just how I am. But I've got colleagues that's not what comes natural to them. They're very effective as people that communicate, directly through anger, directly through being very precise and not suffering fools lightly. And I think it's important that people respect that too, and that those of us that are working in social justice areas aren't always expected to be respectable and diplomatic, right? And so I'd also just say that given how I personally am, I would hate to see that as an endorsement of a certain type of what folks in the U.S. probably elsewhere too call the politics of respectability. But what the last thing I'll just say though, getting back to this question of hope, is some of the most warm, inviting, encouraging Native people I know are not hopeful at all. And I think that one of the things that for some of the dominant culture is to recognize, you can be very motivated, in fact, maybe motivated more than everybody else, to help the environment, to help our non-human relatives, to stop climate change. But that shouldn't mean that you have to accept the reality that things are going to go any differently than they have in the previous eras of colonialism. That the chances are, like literally the chances are, that we're going to end up in a situation that even if we get to carbon zero, the world's going to be a very bad place for Native people, for people of color, and for other groups, to the point where it wouldn't have been an improvement for us. That's where we're headed. But just because that's where the odds are, doesn't mean that I'm less motivated to do something about it. I think the idea that there's some kind of trade-off between what you think is going to happen and your motivation is a very dominant, idea, and speaks to, going back to some stuff that Jay shared, speaks to that fact that we're dealing with a lot of dominant people that are still not horrified by inequities in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. You remind me of, there's a piece by Cornell West about the difference between optimism and hope. And optimism is like, something that clueless people in denial have every day. And it's all fine, let's go ahead. Whereas hope is what's left when everything else is gone. And I think you are speaking from a position of hope in that sense. Jay, hope?
Hope? Nope, I don't think so. I think it's being used as an opiate. I think that this idea that's, and it's also kind of it's also quite often almost compulsory. I mean, I've been told a couple of times when I've been commissioned to write articles, please end on a hopeful note, and I just find it really offensive. Is that because I think it's patronizing to the reader, or to to each other, to say that it's compulsory. And I also think it just doesn't fit the facts. No matter how I look at it, it doesn't fit the facts to be hopeful. But I would say that that the kind of it's what I would look towards in that in that genre, as it were, but slightly differently, is not optimism. It's definitely not hope, not optimism. But I think I would say it's faith. And I don't mean that in the sense that I don't think that that things are going to be okay. It's not a faith in that sense, but it's a faith that there is enough in humanity, and there is enough in the mind, in the human mind, where what matters will persist. It will live, but through, I suspect, a kind of an age which will be an age of horror and ugliness. But I have faith that there will be beauty.
Kyle, is that the faith you share?
Michael, can you say that one more time?
Yeah, is that a faith that you share?
You're trying to get me to say a sentence with faith or hope, or
No, I'm not. It's just, Jay said something which I find very touching and evocative, and I just wonder if it's a shared position or not.
Well, it is.
We don't have to end on a note of hope.
No, I appreciate where Jay is coming from, because I do feel the same way that hope is imposed on us, and that notion of faith, represents, based on your experience and where you're coming from, the kind of thinking that I've been trying to do too, which is that we need to really change our goal and aspirational and motivational and emotional structures beyond these ones that get presented to us on a daily basis, and that are very toxic on our capacity to take the actions that we need to take.
Thank you both. We've come to the end of our time, but I think it's really exciting actually to end this session, and indeed this particular series of events, by opening it up into questions and saying a lot of things have got to change and a lot of things have got to be dismantled, and that's a creative process. And that's one of the things which has been very potent for us in the last few weeks, starting this much slower, much longer version of the Origins Festival, which in some ways seems to be becoming a kind of inquiry into the current moment. And that's a way of me sort of trying to segue into a bit of a plug for the next few weeks. And I'm sorry to do this because it sounds almost commercial on the back of everything we've just said. But there are some more events coming up. As from Monday, we will be streaming Madeline Sayet's production, her solo play, Where We Belong, which we brought to the 2019 festival and was hugely successful at Shakespeare's Globe. That's now been rethought, reformed, and so it's going to stream from an empty theatre in Washington, DC. And because that's about Indigenous travellers to Britain, we're also, alongside it, streaming our film, Hidden Histories. So both of those are available for the next 2 weeks, and go to the website. You'll see many, many more things as the programme slowly unravels itself, right up until next April, God and the Arts Council willing. I want to say a huge thank you to Jay Griffiths and to Kyle Whyte for a fascinating discussion this evening, and thank you also to everybody who's been there out in the cyberspace. We haven't been able to see you, but we very much felt your presence. Thank you to those who asked questions, and thank you to those who listened and absorbed. Your attention is very kind and very welcome. See you all again soon. Bye-bye.